Welcome to Signal Ahead. I'm Alfred. Today's briefing, Cryptography Academic, Sunday, July 5. This is the synthesis above the noise, not the headlines, but the deep currents beneath them. Let's get into it. Welcome and settle in. If you've been reading the security headlines lately, you'd be forgiven for thinking cryptography is having a strange identity crisis. The word still conjures images of prime numbers, elliptic curves, and the elegant mathematics of keeping secrets. But look at what the field is actually producing right now, and you'll notice something quietly remarkable. An enormous share of the work that lives under the banner of cryptography and security has almost nothing to do with hiding a message from an eavesdropper. It's about a machine that thinks, and whether we can trust the thinking. Here is the cross-cutting insight I want to lead with, because a casual reader will miss it entirely. For most of its history, cryptography was in the business of establishing certainty across a boundary you didn't control. You couldn't trust the wire, so you built mathematics that let you trust the message anyway. A signature proved authorship. A cipher proved secrecy. A verified certificate proved identity. The whole enterprise rested on a beautiful assumption that if the syntax checks out, the signature validates, the token authenticates, the format parses, then the substance is safe. Pass the check and you may proceed. That assumption is now breaking, and it's breaking in the same way across a dozen unrelated-looking subfields at once. Consider the notion of a trust boundary semantic gap. The idea is deceptively simple. An artifact, a software update, an authentication token, a signed package crosses from one domain into another. It passes every syntactic validation the receiving system performs. It is well-formed, protocol-compliant, properly signed. And yet nothing about that clean pass establishes that the thing actually satisfies what the receiving domain needs to be true. The signature tells you who sent it. It does not tell you the update is safe to run. The check succeeded, and the compromise proceeds anyway. Now hold that thought and look somewhere that seems completely different. The security of AI coding agents that pull in third-party skills from public marketplaces. A malicious skill runs with the agent's full privileges. It can steal credentials, exfiltrate your source code, plant a backdoor. So people build scanners, pattern matchers, or a language model asked to judge whether the code looks malicious. And the attackers respond with payload-preserving evasion. They keep the malice perfectly intact while transforming its visible form until the scanner sees nothing. Do you hear the echo? The scanner is performing a syntactic pass. The evasion exploits the gap between what the pass establishes and what actually matters. And once more, from a third direction entirely, the question of whether an open-weight model has been obliterated had its refusal mechanism surgically stripped out. A runtime guard can't tell you because a guard scores what the model says, not what the model is. The proposed answer is an audit of the artifact itself, measuring how far the weights have drifted from the base and how the internal activations behave. That's a fascinating admission. It's a confession that watching behavior at the boundary is not enough, and that you must inspect the substance of the thing that crossed it. 3 problems, 3 communities, 1 shape. The field is discovering, over and over, that syntactic validation and semantic security have quietly divorced. And this is precisely the moment when we've handed decision-making to systems whose behavior is not a stable function of their inputs at all. A robot running a vision language model can be slowed to a crawl by scene text that triggers overthinking. The attack isn't a forged credential. It's a prompt that makes the machine deliberate itself into paralysis. An intrusion detector's explanations can be nudged until the very justification an analyst relies on drifts, while the prediction stays put. The old adversary corrupted the message. The new adversary corrupts the reasoning about the message and leaves the message looking pristine. So where does that leave the state of the field? I'd put it this way. Cryptography's classical triumph was to make trust decomposable, to let you verify a small, crisp property and safely build a mountain on top of it. What the current wave of work is telling us, with striking unanimity, is that the small, crisp property no longer implies the mountain. The gap between this passed the check and this is actually safe has widened into the central problem, and it has widened precisely because our systems now interpret, generate, and act rather than merely transmit. Over our next 2 segments, I want to trace what the field is doing about it. First, the retreat from behavior to artifact, this growing conviction that you must audit the thing itself, not just watch what it does. And second, the harder and more philosophical turn, whether we can define, cryptographically, the semantic properties that these boundaries were always silently assuming. Because if we cannot, we will keep building beautiful, correct checks that establish exactly nothing worth knowing. Let's begin there. Welcome back. Before the break, we were sifting through a great heap of new work, dozens of papers, each with its own acronym, its own threat model, its own clever twist. And the temptation, when you look at a pile like that, is to treat it as noise. A scanner evasion here, a backdoor in a speech model there, a withholding attack on a mining pool, a survey of forged passports, miscellany, but I don't think it's miscellany at all. I think there's a deep current running underneath, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Here is the current. For most of its modern history, cryptography and security concern themselves with a beautifully clean question. Is this message authentic? Is this channel confidential? Is this signature valid? These are questions about form, about syntax. Did the bits arrive intact and unaltered, signed by a key we trust? And we became magnificent at answering them. We can prove mathematically that a signature is sound. That's an extraordinary human achievement, and I don't want to diminish it. But listen to what's actually being said across this new work, and you hear the same complaint voiced a dozen different ways. One paper names it precisely, it calls it a trust boundary semantic gap. An artifact crosses from one domain to another. It passes every syntactic check. It is well-formed, protocol-compliant, properly authenticated. The signature is valid, and it is still catastrophic. The update is signed, and it installs a backdoor. The token is authenticated, and it authorizes ruin. What the validation established was true. It was simply insufficient. The check answered, "Is this genuine?" when the question that mattered was, "Does this mean what I need it to mean?" That gap between the genuine and the meaningful, between form and intent, is the deep current. And once you're attuned to it, you find it everywhere in the pile. Consider the coding agents that now reach into public marketplaces and download third-party skills, executing them with the agent's own privileges. The old supply chain question was, is this package what it claims to be, signed by whom it claims? But the evasion work here shows something subtler. You can preserve the malicious behavior entirely intact while transforming its visible appearance until the scanner shrugs and waves it through. The semantics stay hostile, the syntax goes innocent. The scanner was reading the surface. The meaning was underneath, untouched. Or take the strange, almost philosophical problem of trying to tell whether a language model has had its refusal mechanism surgically removed, obliterated, in the jargon. You cannot answer that by watching what it says, because a stripped model and an intact one may produce identical polite refusals in the moment you happen to be looking. The behavior is not the artifact. So the researchers reach inside, they measure an activation gap, they measure the energy of the weight difference from the base model. They stop asking, how does it behave, and start asking, what is it structurally? That is the same current running the other direction. When surface behavior stops being trustworthy, you're forced down into the substance. And the same theme animates the work on logic vulnerabilities in code. Memory safety bugs, the old kind, could be caught because they violated properties you could write down clean, general, expressible. But a logic vulnerability isn't a violated rule, it's a violated intention. It requires you to infer what the system was supposed to mean, the implicit invariant nobody wrote down, buried among unrelated code. Even the frontier models stumble, because meaning isn't sitting there on the surface waiting to be pattern matched. Do you see the shape of it now? Across attack and defense, across blockchains and robots and network traffic and identity documents, the frontier has migrated. It has moved off the question of whether an artifact is authentic and onto the question of whether an authentic artifact carries the meaning we assumed. The adversaries have discovered that the space between valid and correct is enormous and largely undefended, precisely because our whole apparatus of proof lives on the valid side. There's a certain melancholy irony in this. The very success of cryptographic assurance, our triumph over the syntactic question, is what pushed the war into the semantic hills. We solved forgery so well that the forgers stopped forging and started delivering perfectly genuine artifacts whose meaning had been quietly hollowed out. A coin-join transaction that's technically a valid privacy mixer but signals nothing to a regulator. A voting delegation that's cryptographically sealed yet socially coercive. In each case, the mathematics holds and the meaning slips. I suspect this is the structural trend beneath the noise. The discipline is being dragged, sometimes unwillingly, from the study of authenticity to the study of intent, from what an artifact is to what it does in the domain that receives it. And that is a harder country. Intent doesn't yield to a clean theorem. It lives in context, in assumptions, in the receiving domain's requirements. Which raises the uncomfortable question we'll turn to next. Can the tools that gave us certainty about form ever give us anything like certainty about meaning? There's a phrase that keeps surfacing across the work I've been reading lately, though never in quite these words, and it goes something like this: passing the check is not the same as being safe. One of the papers gives it a proper name, the trust boundary semantic gap, and I think that name deserves to travel far beyond the narrow corner of the literature where it was coined, because it may be the single most useful lens for understanding where security is heading over the next few years. Consider what it says. Modern systems accept artifacts across boundaries: a signed software update, an authenticated token, a well-formed document, a compliant network packet. And we have built beautiful machinery to verify these things. Signatures verify, formats parse, protocols comply. All of that machinery can be correctly implemented, functioning exactly as designed, and yet the thing it waves through can still ruin you. Because a signature tells you an artifact is authentic, it does not tell you the artifact is benign. The syntactic parse establishes something true, and that true thing is simply insufficient for what the receiving domain actually needs. The gap is not a bug in the check. The gap is the space between what the check proves and what safety requires. Now, why does this matter more now than it did a decade ago? Because we are busily building systems whose entire mode of operation is to accept artifacts across trust boundaries at machine speed, on the strength of exactly these shallow guarantees. An AI coding agent reaches into a public marketplace and pulls down a third-party skill, which then runs with the agent's full privileges. The skill scanner looks at it, pattern matches, perhaps asks another model to judge whether it seems malicious, and one of the studies shows, rather bleakly, that you can preserve the malicious behavior entirely while transforming its visible form until the scanner sees nothing at all. The attack semantics stay intact, only the appearance changes. That is the semantic gap in its purest form. The scanner was checking what the payload looks like. The attacker simply stopped making it look like anything. You see the same pattern everywhere once you have the eye for it. An intrusion detection system flags anomalies by score, and an adversary nudges a malicious flow until the anomaly score drops below threshold without altering the underlying attack at all. The defender is left with no honest way to tell a benign flow from a carefully perturbed hostile one, because the thing being measured was never the thing that mattered. Standard cells, the humble building blocks of nearly every chip on the market, pass through synthesis and implementation looking entirely ordinary, while carrying tampering that the whole verification pipeline was never designed to interrogate. In each case, the check is real, the check works, and the check is beside the point. So what should we watch for? I would watch first for the migration of security, thinking from the syntactic to the semantic, from does this parse, is this signed, does this match a pattern, toward does this satisfy the properties my domain actually depends on. That is a much harder question because semantic properties are often implicit. One of the more interesting efforts on logic vulnerabilities makes exactly this point. The bugs that matter most are not memory safety violations you can state as a crisp rule, but violations of application-specific invariants that nobody ever wrote down, buried among unrelated code. Detecting those requires reconstructing intent, not matching signatures. And reconstructing intent is precisely what our syntactic machinery cannot do. Second, I would watch the arms race dynamic, because it has a peculiar shape here. When your defense is a classifier or a scanner or a judge model, the defense is itself an artifact with a decision boundary, and decision boundaries can be probed, mapped, and slipped past. There is even work now on reconnaissance against guardrails, figuring out, from the outside, whether you were blocked by a guardrail or refused by the model's own alignment, because the two require different evasion strategies. The very existence of that research tells you the defensive layer has become a terrain to be surveyed. Every check we add is also a check that can be studied. And third, the hopeful note, I would watch for the humbler complementary defenses. The paper on obliterated checkpoints is instructive. No single signal reliably tells you whether a model's refusal mechanism has been stripped, but two cheap signals, negatively correlated and covering each other's blind spots, do rather well together. That is the shape of the way forward, not one perfect check that closes the gap, because no such check exists, but layered, redundant, mutually compensating evidence that narrows it. The lesson I take from all of this is a quiet reorientation of what we should demand. Stop asking whether the artifact passed. Ask what precisely passing established, and then ask with some rigor what remains unestablished. Because it is in that remainder, the unestablished part, that everything interesting and everything dangerous is going to happen. That's the signal for today. The noise will keep coming, we'll keep finding what's underneath it. This has been Signal Ahead with Alfred. Until next time.